Let's stay with the Constitution, because on this day in 1996, Parliament adopted the Constitution of South Africa. For more on possible further changes to the Constitution, I'm joined in our Cape Town studios by constitutional expert Phephelaphi Dube. Afternoon to you, Phephelaphi. I suppose one cannot begin this conversation any other way but with getting a sense, having seen that vote in Parliament on land expropriation without compensation. We've also seen today the appointment of a new National Director of Public Prosecutions. Is our Constitution in safe hands?
Absolutely. It would appear as if the Constitution is in safe hands, because we need to bear in mind that the guardians of the Constitution isn't just the government alone, but we also have excellent institutions such as the Judiciary and indeed the media, the Fourth Estate itself, which has been playing a very wonderful role in terms of holding powerful figures accountable. So in that sense, South Africa is maturing as a democracy, and I think there are definite tests, but I think on the whole, the nation is standing up to its name as a constitutional democracy.
We're seeing, just on what you've mentioned, as far as the media is concerned, we're at a time when the media and politicians are clashing, some would say more than ever before. We're seeing the back and forth between some journalists and the EFF. The media has had problems with the ANC and its leaders in the past. How important is it that that conversation or those relations be brought to some sense of a more civil approach if we are going to continue to protect and put forward the ideals enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand the role of press freedom in the South African context, and also to understand the manner in which press freedom in South Africa is enjoyed compared to a lot of countries in the world. So to that extent, there is a very robust enjoyment of the right of freedom of expression, and the press in South Africa isn't, the press in South Africa is not regulated by the state. It's a self-regulating exercise. So in that sense, compared to a lot of countries in the world, South African media, the South African press is in a very good state. But that said, I think it is quite concerning if we note the number of attacks that have been carried out on journalists, if we note the number of threats that have been carried out on journalists. And I think we also need to bear in mind the deaths of journalists such as Sunev Venter in that regard. So these latest developments are quite concerning. But at the same time, South Africa enjoys a robust democracy in which people are free to offend and they're free to take offense at the same time. So I think what we're seeing is really a maturing of South Africa's democracy, and just bearing in mind where we've come from and where we are right now, I think it's safe to say that freedom of expression in South Africa is robustly enjoyed, and it's definitely going to ride through the current attacks that we're seeing.
One of the arguments that we've found ourselves having to deal with in recent years, especially in the latter part of former President Jacob Zuma's term, was this idea that the country is being run by the courts, having seen the likes of the EFF, the DA, and civil society having to repeatedly take the government to court to rectify decisions or have politicians like the former president held to account. Should we be worried about the sense that the country is being running through the courts, and how do we unravel, if you will, that worry about the judiciary and the legislature clashing about their various roles?
Well, I think that there could possibly be reasons to be concerned about the nature of the courts and the involvement of the courts in what are ultimately political cases. But at the same time, we need to bear in mind the nature in which our democracy is supposed to work, in the sense that Parliament's ultimate role is to hold members of the executive accountable. And I think when Parliament itself fails its oversight, when Parliament fails its oversight duties, then it leaves the courts no room but to weigh into matters which are ultimately matters which should be decided before Parliament. So if we consider the Nkandla matter, for example, the fact that it was really ultimately the National Assembly that should have held the former president accountable, but the National Assembly failed to do that, and there was no other recourse but to turn to the courts. But at the same time, I think we also need to bear in mind the wonderful, robust role that civic society plays in South Africa. I think in the last couple of years, we saw the massive demonstrations that were out on the streets. We saw a lot of outpouring from ordinary South Africans from all walks of life who were displeased at the manner in which the former president was conducting himself. So I think if we just bear in mind the fact that ultimately it's up to the other branches of government to also come to the table and do their part. And I think if they do that, it takes away the pressure from the courts to weigh into what are ultimately political matters. But of course, it's also important to bear in mind the role that civic society plays in ensuring that we have a robust and accountable government.
Tell me this then, Phephelaphi, as far as our very complex racial and socio-economic problems and others are concerned, are all the answers found in the Constitution, or is there more that can be done to aid such a crucial piece of legal documentation?
Well, of course, the Constitution is the backbone of South African society, but the Constitution on its own is not a self-executing document. To some large degree, it depends on a functioning, ethical and well-run state in order to discharge the various functions of the state. For example, we have socio-economic rights in the Constitution, which to a large degree depend on the state. And I think we all know about the social grant debacle in the sense that the Constitution provides that deserving individuals should have a right to social assistance. But then on the other hand, we had a woefully inept former minister of social security. And of course, that means that South Africans aren't able to enjoy their constitutionally enshrined rights due to the shortcomings and due to the failures of some members of the executive. So it is important for just going forward, it is important to make sure that we have a state that's capable and that's able to discharge its constitutional obligations.
Chapter 2, the Bill of Rights, deals with, amongst other things, the protection of children. And you and I are having this conversation right in the middle of that 16 days of activism against the abuse of women and children. Have we lived up then to the constitutional ideals as far as protecting children and women in this country? And where do we lay the blame for just the ever-rising levels of abuse of these two groups?
Well, I think when it comes to the question of where blame needs to be laid, I think that's really a multifaceted question in the sense that we need to look at the responsible institutions. So institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority, and I think we all know the allegations of political interference, which have rendered the organization almost incapable of discharging its mandate. And then we also need to consider the South African Police Services on the other hand, where there too, they've been a lot of problems that have been leveled at its leadership. And also if we consider, the ever-rising crime rates and the fact that between the South African Police Service and the National Prosecuting Authority, we don't seem to be holding individuals accountable and that we seem to have a revolving door justice system. But not just that, I think also when we consider the family structure as well, the fact that we have so many children who aren't being brought up by their fathers in South Africa, the fact that we have so many dysfunctional schools, the fact that we have so many teachers who aren't showing up to work. I think if we look at these problems in a multifaceted manner and try and address them, but just in a cross-cutting way, I think there can be a solution. I think we shouldn't just be looking at, for example, the South African Police Services on its own, but it needs to be an all-encompassing look at just the problems that are affecting South African society from the family through to its institutions.
Do you think the challenges of the past few years have allowed the broader public more access and more understanding of just what is in the Constitution? And how do we continue to make sure that the average South African has a clear understanding of what the Constitution says about their rights and responsibilities, not only of their own, but of employers as far as labour is concerned, what it is that Parliament is supposed to do, what it is that the courts are supposed to do for a citizen?
I think by and large, if we consider, the well-documented incidents that took place in Parliament, I think for better or worse, they've actually increased the public interest in the work of Parliament. For example, if we consider the manner in which the EFF conducted itself in parliamentary sittings when the former president would appear before Parliament, the simple slogan of pay back the money. I think in a sense, it made the work of Parliament accessible to the ordinary person on the street, and it made people show an interest in the parliamentary channel. And it also just made it quite clear and made it quite apparent that Parliament has the ultimate function of holding members of the executive accountable, and that Parliament has an oversight function over members of the executive. But of course, I think beyond that, beyond the theatrics, beyond the gimmicks, it is important for people to have a true understanding of the Constitution, for people to be able to claim their rights, to know where exactly where they can go in order to claim their rights, and what they should do in instances where their rights are not being protected. And I think perhaps that's where the gap lies, the fact that people may well be aware of what the Constitution provides, but beyond that, there's perhaps a little understanding of what the remedies are in the instance where their rights are not being protected or where their rights are being abused.